Thank you very much for inviting me. I feel very privileged to be here. It's not the first time I've been involved in an institute occasion. I think the work you do here in Toronto and Canada generally is of great international significance, so I'm pleased to be here. You will be no doubt aware of the British television program Monty Python, historical or otherwise. There is a well-known line, and now for something completely different. I'm afraid I have to confess that that is probably a reasonable description of what you're now going to hear in terms of my presentation, because I'm not going to talk about experience rating. I hope I am going to talk a little bit about economic incentives, but I'm trying to take two views. One, a more macro level view of current approaches to regulating and generally making health and safety management more effective. And also, I want to focus on one particular area of current approaches, which is around the possibility of using leverage within supply chains to improve health and safety management. I see this possibility as being related to economic and business incentives. That's the connection with your conference, tenuous though it may be. Anyway, what I'm going to focus on for the next half hour or so are financial incentives in improving occupational health and safety performance in modern economies. I want to talk about the case of supply chain leverage and what drives it. I'm going to use two studies that I have been involved in over the last few years, and in particular within those two studies, I will try to illustrate my talk with reference to some material from one of those studies where I'm looking at two case studies of supply chains and their positive effects on health and safety. And hopefully I will offer some reflections at the end of the presentation about the limits of this type of influence and its possible role. By way of background, none of this should come as any great surprise to you. The motif of economic life at the present time, and it has been so for the last 20 or 30 years, is change in the structure and organization of work, with the growth of importance of organizational outsourcing of production, service, and labor. And what this has been associated with, as many people have pointed out, is the creation of more fragmented and decentered patterns of employment. And there is evidence that outsourcing has been driven by business rationales that seem to offer improved attractiveness in terms of costs and risks, the avoidance of so-called internal constraints like having employees, the access to improved access to external expertise, supposed enhanced quality and flexibility in business, and the possibility of management and senior management to have greater internal business focus are some of the reasons given for increased outsourcing. Whatever they are, the research evidence suggests that they pose significant challenges to conventional regulation of occupational health and safety management, and, by the way, also in relation to insurance schemes and other parts of the general infrastructure of support for occupational health and safety. In parallel with these developments, there have been sea changes taking place in the way in which occupational health and safety is governed. The whole concept of so-called new governance is a kind of catch-all phrase to try to capture these changes. But again, I'm oversimplifying, and I'm trying to get through this introductory bit fairly quickly. Um, but they're characterized by a greater emphasis, a greater interest in soft law as opposed to hard regulation, and interest in economic incentives and the business case fit very much within this new scenario. There's also a substantial, at least in Europe, a substantial requirement to justify the economic case for regulation, and significant changes have taken place in the approach of labour inspectorates towards seeking compliance. The idea of cascading prevention messages, reaching the hard to reach, and improving stakeholder engagement have all developed alongside conventional approaches to inspection. Indeed, more controversially, one might suggest that they have developed as an alternative to more conventional approaches to labour inspection, as resources and the political will for this type of state intervention has declined. And within all of this, the idea of using supply chain relations to improve occupational health and safety, particularly amongst lower tier suppliers, has emerged. Why? Well, I think, speaking pragmatically and possibly somewhat cynically, one might say, well, because it fits within this new governance agenda. It solves or tries to solve several problems for regulation in the new economy. A focus on supply chains as an instrument for improving health and safety helps also to promote the business case scenario and the economic arguments for good health and safety practice. It resonates well with the corporate social responsibility agenda, which has also developed around the same period. It's fashionable, and it's particularly fashionable in confrontation of some of the problems that arise in globalization, particularly with the outsourcing of work to administrations, to in industries in countries with administrations where regulating labour standards are not as well resourced or as well developed. And the idea of ratcheting labour standards is again a supply chain concept. Most of the arguments for increased use of supply chains talk about voluntary and market-based mechanisms of achieving positive results. They are intended to reach the so-called hard to reach for the regulators, and also to be more adept, more appropriate for addressing networks of production and services. And of course, they can contribute to the relief of poorly resourced regulatory inspectors and inspection bodies, to some extent at least, of the need to inspect. But of course, the key question is, what evidence is there that they actually work? So, to come to my specific interest in more detail, in the last few years, I've been involved in two fairly substantial studies looking at supply chains. The first one was a study that Phil James and I conducted in 2009, which was essentially a review of the research evidence on the broad approach of the development of business focus on supply chains, and within that, a review of the literature which shed some more direct light on the way in which they act to either worsen or improve health and safety management. Stemming from that research, which we finished a couple of years ago and which is published, came the second study, where we basically had to go and put our money where our mouths were and do some empirical studies to see if the propositions that we had made in our more theoretical analysis kind of held up in practice. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those studies today. Supply chains, for better or worse, as far as health and safety is concerned. I have to say from the outset that most of the evidence points to the increased role of market logistics or market logic leading to poorer health and safety outcomes. and they're largely the result of the effects of outsourcing to smaller and weaker organizations that are unable to deliver the level of, haven't got the capacity to deliver the level of health and safety management that larger organizations had. In supply chains, there is usually a balance of power, and where more powerful buyers are able to impose price and delivery demands on weaker suppliers, very often that means that the will and capacity within these weaker bodies, which is weak in the first place, becomes even weaker as they struggle to meet either the price or the delivery demands that are imposed upon them. And in all of this, there is a marginalized role for organized labor. As we restructure, destructure, whatever the appropriate term is, you move further away from conventional employment relations in which organized labor has an established position, and you create environments in which organized labor is no longer in a position of strength. Organized labor is a somewhat reactive institution. It takes it a little while to catch up, to put it politely. And I think that I'll return to this later, but there are clearly major challenges for the current for organized labor in the current construction of both structure and process in the economy in this respect. However, the good news, in certain cases, leverage in supply chain relationships is used to demand standards on health and safety from suppliers. Asymmetrical supply chain relationships afford opportunities for powerful buyers not to drive down standards, but to do the opposite and to improve supplier health and safety. And there are examples in the literature of how this operates. In industries such as construction, mining, transport, clothing and footwear, food, we find cases of such leverage. And it is two of those cases that I want to turn to now to try to focus this presentation. In the work that Phil James and I did, we ended up by trying to put forward some propositions of how do we explain supply chain leverage, influence, whatever. And what does it depend on? And basically what we said in a fairly vague sort of way was that attention to health and safety by supply chain buyers varied according to a number of differences in such things as how far the way in which health and safety is managed by suppliers actually has implications for the effective supply of required goods and services. Okay? Where it does have implications for the supply of the service or the goods or whatever it is, are those implications such that the pressure on the supplier is to improve or maintain their standards of health and safety, or is it the reverse? In most situations, I've tried to suggest it's probably the reverse. But in some situations, it could be the former. And so what kinds of things might help to ensure that it is the former rather than the latter? And I think the answer to that lies somewhere in the extent to which pressures are exerted by private or public regulation. And the attempts by buyers to influence their supplier health and safety management more positively, the research evidence tends to sort of indicate that they'll work better when they're supported by adequate monitoring and penalty regimes, and they occur within a supply relationship which is relatively collaborative and trust-based. What I'm not able to go into this morning is, of course, that there is a huge variation in the nature of supply relationships. And one of the important things that I think the occupational health and safety system and practitioners, researchers and so forth need to get to grips with is to understand a little more about that complexity before we accept the rhetoric of governance and policy that suggests, we can put everything in the same bucket and say that, yes, this works, or no, that doesn't work. It's a little more nuanced and complicated. Anyway, we thought we would go off and do some sector-based case studies to test these propositions. And conveniently, they decided to hold the London Olympics in London. And so we were able to go and look at how supply chain relations work in construction. Construction is one of those industries, for a number of very good reasons, where there has been some focus on the role of supply chains. And and on the Olympic Park build, the relationships within supply chains were undoubtedly a significant element in managing a very complex build. Okay? And I mean, the first thing to say is that they were very successful at managing this thing. In terms of the history of making Olympic sports facilities, I think the London Olympics probably stand out as a success story in managing to avoid killing the workers who were responsible for making the facilities, and indeed in reducing very substantially the number of injuries and so forth experienced by such workers. I've tried in that sort of schematic that you can see on the screen to illustrate the way in which the supply chains within the park were structured. At the head of the supply chain, you have the client, which is the Olympic Delivery Authority, the ODA. And the ODA has a partner, which is there called CLM, which is like the management body that was responsible for the delivery and supervision of the actual work. And then there were a substantial number of very large principal contractors. In the middle of the slide, you see something called Titan CF Industries. That's our anonymizing name for a very large British multinational, actually, construction firm that was one of a number of big suppliers, but it was the one that we focused on in our research. And then the little boxes underneath show the second and third tier suppliers, the contractors and the subcontractors that were subcontracted to Titan in order to deliver various parts of the build. And there were lower tiers than that. We just didn't go down any further than that. That was far enough, believe me. What did we find? This isn't rocket science, by the way. We found that in order to achieve the health and safety standards from suppliers that they did achieve on the park, the ODA and its delivery partner, CLM, had a variety of strategies in place, which could be summed up as being procurement strategies, communication and coordination strategies, training strategies, the conspicuous, very conspicuous presence of monitoring and supervision on the park, and the very real threat to the businesses of the people who were working there of exclusion from the park if you don't toe the line. And on top of all of that, a significantly different role for the regulator, the Health and Safety Executive Construction Inspectorate that were there. Okay? So from just to rub this in a little bit, from the client's point of view, the Director of Construction for the ODA says, the client leadership issue is very important. The difference between us and a lot of public sector organizations is that we're incredibly intrusive. So we have been really clear about this. We are incredibly intrusive into the supply chain for all sorts of reasons. And he goes on to talk about not just health and safety, but employment conditions and so on and so on. And the principal contractor, talking about their contractors and subcontractors, says they may be the greatest company, they may be potentially the cheapest, but if they've got a dismal health and safety record, and these are questions we specifically ask, I'm sorry, but they don't go forward. And he's talking about the pre-tendering vetting. All right, this isn't even to the stage of the contract yet. We're talking, this isn't the tender, this is the stage before the tender. And you go from getting through that vetting process to be allowed to tender. If you are successful, the tender will commit you to a set of contract specifications about your health and safety standards. They will be reinforced by the requirement for you to produce certification of your workers, certification of your management systems, certification of virtually anything that moves, it seemed to me sometimes. And production of this sort of thing isn't enough. There will be monitoring of compliance at every stage. And indeed, on the Olympic Park, there were two parallel monitoring schemes. CLM, the delivery partner of the ODA, had its monitoring scheme. The ODA monitored CLM with its own monitoring. Very, very comprehensive system. And from the workers' perspective, generally there were two kinds of comments. Mostly they were positive, as these are, or at least the first one is. He says, yes, but 1,000,000 times better. I can tell you that. Everything's more exaggerated, so you've got to pay more attention. So it's better. And this is a third-tier subcontractor talking. And the other guy says, like you walk around here without your glasses on, yellow card. It's a British soccer allusion. I hope you're well up on these things. And what happens is, if you get 2 yellow cards, then you're issued with a straight red card, which means you're off. And what that actually means is that you're out of a job. Okay, so these guys are not messing around. And from the contractors' perspectives, they say, at the end of the day, we've got the contract. If we want more work, then the incentive is to get it right in the first place. So everything for them, really, we've got to do it. Otherwise, it won't, no work. And he's talking about health and safety. Interestingly, the regulator comes at this from a different perspective to the conventional approach, as I said. What the regulator did was to go in with the ODA at the stage of the planning of the building of the park. They organized the systems with the ODA and with its delivery partner. They were in at the outset. And as the Chief Inspector of Construction said, we took things to another level. How they could facilitate health and safety, actually how you then coordinate and communicate the issues to be managed by the suppliers. And he says a lot of this comes back to the issue of, dare I say, collaborative working. They didn't inspect, okay? They didn't go around inspecting. They left that to the ODA and its delivery partner to do. They were operating at a different coordinating level. An interesting and apparently, in this context, successful strategy. But I think there are issues that one needs to develop from that. The other case study we did is very, very different industry, merchant shipping. And we looked at the tanker trade, the independent tanker trade, that the tankers that carry the oil of the major oil companies who are not using their own tankers to do this. It's a significant part of the oil transport industry. Supply chains in merchant shipping are incredibly complicated, and I can't begin to unpack the complications for you in the time I have available. One of the most straightforward ones, though, is in this part of the industry. And essentially, I've tried to outline it in that schema there. If you can only see the boxes and the little ships at the bottom, that's probably sufficient. But at the head of the supply chain are the major petrochemical companies and their organization, OCIMF. And then that has a direct connection to the independent tanker companies. And off to the right and left, you have the terminal operators, who very often are the oil majors themselves anyway, or members of the same association. And off to the other side, you have the oil major organization, OCIMF, that I always forget what it stands for, but it's the Oil Companies International Marine Forum, I think it stands for. And an interesting body called SIRE, which is the ship inspection program that the oil majors run, which is quite separate from public regulation. Okay? All of that exerts, as you'll see in a moment, downward pressures on the tanker companies and their seafarers. And it seems to work. Statistics will show you, such for what they're worth in the maritime industry, which is not a hell of a lot, but at least as far as the better end is concerned, oil and chemical tankers are among the trade as a whole is amongst the safest in merchant shipping in terms of ship incidents and injuries and fatalities. Not surprising, because when there is a ship incident, obviously it's a major problem. Okay, so there are not as many, and they're more noticeable too. Oil majors are the important buyers in the industry. There are a small number of them. They are incredibly powerful. And they're also very influential in organizing the berths for the tankers at refineries or terminals, which either already belong to them or where they have a very strong interest. And the ship inspection program is a program that is set up by the oil majors in order to inspect tankers and to vet tanker companies. And so they do the same thing as the ODA did, in as much as they exert powerful influences through procurement, monitoring, and sanctions. They also have their own tanker management self-assessment program, in which there's a safety management system that the tanker companies are meant to implement. What the tanker companies told us was that as far as their dependence on the oil majors for their business is concerned, as I said, when we go to any terminal, whether it's an oil major or not an oil major, or even charter our ships to non-oil majors, we still need to be inspected and passed by them. Such is their reach in this sector. The whole industry is run by them. You can't do business without their approval. So the oil majors are in a very, very powerful position. And on occupational health and safety management, they say, well, since this scheme, TMSA, that the oil majors have introduced, they even have control now over us in our office. They can say how to run our ships, how to manage our store supply, which courses we should conduct in-house, how many additional safety equipments should be used, and so on. It's not in this quote, but I have another quote which says very specifically how they develop the safety management system within the tanker companies from the outside, and how the tanker companies are obliged to comply. And the seafarers themselves, talking about the very, very intrusive and extensive regime of inspection that the oil majors and SIRE organizes, say, we expect those oil major inspection. The inspection was very strict. As seafarers, we also feared, since their inspection included hundreds of items. The inspection was very, very much detailed. And in relation to public regulation, interestingly, what they say is we didn't feel special in the port state control inspection. That's the public inspection. After the oil majors inspection, we felt that it was simple to deal with the port state control inspection, implying that the standard that was required was much, much higher. There's little doubt that in those two examples, supply chain interventions, leverage within supply chains, works to the benefit, not the exclusive benefit. I could go on about some of the downsides of some of these things, but overall seems to be working to the benefit of health and safety management amongst suppliers. What you see in the examples I've described, of course, is a highly interventionist buyer intervening in the everyday management of health and safety amongst their suppliers. This isn't always the case. We looked at other examples. In fact, this study was originally intended to do two parallel examples. We looked at the Olympic Park. We also did another case study of the same major contractor, but on a different site, to see if the practices were transferred. And in the maritime industry, we also looked at the container trade to see what the differences were there. I haven't got time to talk about all of that now. I just want you to know that, again, the supply chain relations that I'm talking about don't necessarily have to be quite so interventionist in order to produce these kinds of effects. But the other thing that I think I do need to stress is that what we are looking at, and it is to some extent by definition what researchers get access to, we're looking at high-end companies. We're looking at companies who have a vested interest in their reputational risk and so forth. We're not looking at the lower end. In the shipping industry, this is significant because substandard shipping is a very serious issue, but as a researcher, you'd be very, very lucky indeed to get anywhere near it. I'm not sure you'd be that lucky, actually, because you might not come back again. You need to bear that in mind. And construction is the same, obviously. One of the things I wasn't able to show in my schematic, but which is also important, is that one of the very positive things about the case studies that we looked at was not only was the vertical communication that I described in evidence, but there was also a horizontal communication. On the Olympic Park, Titan Construction was not the only major supplier, as I said. There were a number of other major contracting companies. They did relate to one another. They did use the same practices. They all worked in the same way with the regulator and so forth. There was definitely a horizontal level of communication there. So why? Clearly, in the examples that I've given you, buyers and suppliers were sufficiently incentivized and economically incentivized, financially incentivized, if you like, in relation to their reputational risks, in relation to the high costs that would be associated with failure. They were highly visible organizations, and in relation to their market position. The other thing to stress is the very important role of surveillance here. And I think in terms of discussion about inspection, whether it's public or private, the take-home message here is that it's necessary. And, these organizations lower down the supply chain left us in little doubt that they wouldn't be doing these things unless they were obliged to by not just what it said in the contract, but the fact that the contract was being enforced by somebody looking over their shoulder with fairly regular occurrence. And the other point that I wanted to make was that there was no evidence in our study to indicate that any of this worked actually in the absence of a regulatory framework, as it is often claimed that it does. Even in the tanker trade, where it appeared at first sight that the oil majors had kind of completely taken over the role of regulation, that wasn't actually true. They were operating very much within the regulatory framework such as it exists in the global maritime industry. The problem with the regulatory framework in the global maritime industry is that it works reasonably well between North America and Europe, and it's a basket case in the rest of the world, more or less. The regulatory framework was nevertheless there. And indeed, in the other case study that we did, which was on the container trade, the seafarers in that study were very, very clear that as far as the container ships were concerned, it was the regulatory framework that was a significant driver of good practice in that industry. Again, it's complicated. The ships that I sailed on sailed actually between Halifax and Liverpool, and they were trading between North America and Europe. And so, the regulatory framework and inspection in that sense was important. So I want to leave you with a couple of reflections. How typical are these situations? Are they transferable? Can they be extended to other sectors or situations? And yes, external drivers promoting financial or business incentives are important. But I think a more sophisticated take needs to be made on what their implications are for the role of regulation and regulatory inspection than has been the case to date. In my view, as a researcher looking at this work in detail over the last couple of years, I can't see evidence that they are a replacement for this framework and the regulation at all. But I can see that the regulator internationally needs to change their act a little bit if they're actually going to take serious advantage of these kinds of scenarios. We also need to understand much more clearly about what the limits are, where they will work, and where it's not worth even considering that they're going to work. I think there are many of those latter situations. And finally, last, but Andy will be very pleased to know, not least, I can see that there are major implications here for the role of organized labor. As I said at the beginning, I mean, clearly, if you're looking at the drivers of change and the drivers of good practice in occupational health and safety historically or in any other way, trade unions play a fundamentally significant role. Right? Goes without, well, I have to say it, but I shouldn't have to say that. But if you change the basic framework and the structure and the processes where the focus lies for making those interventions and making those changes and making that drive actually work, how does organized labor respond to this? I know quite a lot about organized labor and occupational health and safety, and I'm afraid I cannot see at this present moment in time a substantial or effective, wide-ranging strategy in which organized labor is really able to engage here. I can see that they are getting their act together in terms of being an external driver, much as the same as other groups in civil society are. Accident victims groups and so forth. These obviously play an important role. My question is, how does that role get engaged in the intricacies of these kinds of situations, and not just one of looking at things from the outside? And on that note, I thank you for your attention.